Let's talk about live streaming in low light with these two cameras. This is a Sony as-300. This is a DJI Osmo Action4. They're both action cameras. They both work very well for live streaming, but this one can have a little bit of trouble live streaming in low light settings with the auto settings. You can do some stuff to make it better, but flat out, it doesn't get as good as this does in low light. And I've got the receipts. I'll show you some video samples in a minute. Let's get into why they're different and why the Sony performs so much better, even though it's an old discontinued camera and this is a brand new, off the shelf, still available, modern generation camera. The Sony has got an optically stabilized sensor. This uses electronic image stabilization. The difference between those two things is that the Sony physically has got pieces inside of it that move around to help stabilize any jitters or shaking that's going on. And it doesn't need to rely on digital trickery, which is how the DJI cam does it. GoPros operate in a similar fashion. Basically what's happening, without getting too deep into the woods with the stabilization on these cameras, is that they raise the shutter speed very high. And with that raised shutter speed, it eliminates a lot of motion blur that a camera would normally have. And that doesn't look good in terms of natural motion movement, but it allows the cameras to do this trickery that really makes the image feel very, very flat and very, very stabilized. You know how like a super high level GoPro setting or the highest level stabilization settings on these action cams look. It looks really, really, really smooth, almost to the point of it being unnatural. And like I said, the way that it's doing that is that it's raising the shutter speed extremely high sometimes. If you have a lot of bright sunlight, it'll put the shutter speed at like 1/500th of a second. And that's just getting so many, the shutter is firing so quickly within every second that it's giving it a lot of data to then triangulate and do a bunch of like digital math and stuff to straighten the image out without any motion blur inside of anything, because it's taking the picture so fast that it's just got a lot of very crisp images. So if you think about like when you take a photo with a regular camera and you lower the shutter speed, if you move like this, you're gonna see a lot of motion blur. So if you just take and turn the shutter speed way up and then you move the same way and take a picture, you're gonna get a much cleaner image with the shutter speed very, very quickly. However, the faster you turn the shutter speed up, the lower quality you're going to get in low light scenarios, because it is lowering the time that light is hitting the sensor, okay? So in order to increase low light capabilities on a camera, do it video, photo, whatever, you can lower the shutter down. And if the camera is not moving, you're going to get a lot more light in and it's going to be brighter. Okay, so what these cameras do in the night is they kind of fail because they need that fast shutter to keep everything stable, but they have to slow the shutter way down to allow more light to come in. And because it relies so heavily on that high shutter speed to do its stabilization, you end up getting a really mushy image when the shutter speed is very slow in low light. So the Sony sort of doesn't cheat, it just goes about it a different way. Since it's physically pieces inside of the sensor moving around to stabilize things, it doesn't need to rely on that super fast shutter speed to stabilize the image. So it can continually run at like 1/60th of a second if you're running a 30 FPS video stream, and it'll look the same in low light, in dark, whatever. And of course the image will be light, brighter or darker depending on the lighting conditions. But they've kind of tuned this one in where in low light scenarios that are reasonably low light, and super dark it doesn't do good, but in like, you know, city light and stuff like that, it actually looks pretty true to life. And they've done a pretty good job of balancing out the way that the ISO and stuff behaves inside of this camera to keep it from just getting too dark in scenarios where a human can normally see. It's a little bit darker than what your eyes can see, but it's pretty close. It feels pretty true to life. This, on the other hand, they go crazy with it. If you take this and you put it into a dark area and you're running it at 30 FPS, it's gonna drop the shutter all the way down to like 1/25th, which is less than half of what it should be running at to maintain a steady image. But it's doing that just to bring in more light in a last-ditch effort to make the image brighter. The problem is that with an action cam, and what you do with action cams is you do action stuffs. So the camera is always in motion, especially with IRL. So when I use this camera, it's mounted on my shoulder on a backpack strap. And I walk around and I walk like a normal person. There's like, footsteps and stuff like that. In bright light, looks fine. When it gets dark and this thing starts driving the shutter way down to like 1/25th, you end up with situations where footage looks bad. Look at this footage and you'll see, especially in the brighter areas where the lights are, that there's just a lot of distortion and just softness, and it's shaking around. And in my opinion, this is barely watchable. Honestly, it's probably not watchable. I would not stream with that type of quality. Now, if we go and we look at the same scene that was filmed on the as-300, it's going to look a lot smoother, and to be honest with you, the Sony colors are way more accurate. The DJI comes off kind of green and gross looking. The Sony looks maybe a little bit too magenta, but it looks way more like what the actual scene looks like with your real eyes. We've established that the Action4 looks pretty bad right out of the box on auto mode in low light. However, DJI has given us the ability to change and lock the shutter speed manually inside of the menu system. And you can do this while it's live and streaming in webcam mode. I don't know if you can do this when it's running RTMP mode, but I know if it's running a cable in UVC over a USB line, you can set the shutter speed. And what I've done is I've gone ahead and I've locked the shutter speed here to 1/60th of a second. You're gonna see a pretty big dip in the brightness level compared to when it was allowed to do whatever it wanted with the shutter speed, but it looks way smoother and way more watchable. I would say it's not quite as smooth as the Sony cam, but it's getting into that territory. At this stage, I would say my issue with it is more color rendition and this greenness that is coming across on the screen, but at least it's not unwatchable. I would say that this is functional. Just as a test, just to get rid of the last bit of jitters, I went in and set the DJI cam to run at 1/100th, and it looks smoother to the point of where almost all the jitters have vanished, but the darkness level has gotten to the point where it's getting probably a little bit too dark. Streaming in the daylight, I would pick this every single time. This is so much better to use because it's so much smaller. You can put it here. It doesn't get obtrusive. It's not up on your shoulder like a parrot. This thing is just ridiculous looking when you walk around, but this almost disappears. People barely ever look at it. It runs off one cable for data. It also delivers power to the camera, and it's just rock solid. I like having a little screen on it sometimes so you can actually frame shots. You can see things. It's something you kind of get used to not having a screen on this, but it's just a nice addition. It also can hook in wirelessly with the DJI Mic 2. You don't have to have any additional hardware or anything. You just turn this on, bam, it syncs, and now you've got wind protected audio because you can put a poof ball on the top. It has a lot of advantages. If you primarily stream at nighttime, it'd be hard to recommend it. You can do it, but it will not look as good as this does at night. This has just got a cleaner looking image. It is more stabilized. The color is more accurate. There's no way around it. This is still superior in that setting. What I would suggest if you're streaming with the DJI cam is to set all the settings in bright light to auto. Just let it do everything on its own. But once you get into a dark situation, go into the menus, set it to manual exposure, and make sure that your ISO is available to go as high as possible. Then go into the shutter speed and set the shutter speed to either 1/50th or 1/60th of a second. If you get flickering lights where you are, try the opposite one from whichever one you set. Somewhere in that area is going to be probably a pretty good middle ground that's going to give you decent looking stabilization and enough light that you can get away with walking around with a body mounted camera. If you have the means and you stream a lot at night, this is the way to go. Go with the Sony. But this is not a devastating disaster if you're willing to dive around in the menus now and then to just accommodate the settings to the environment that you're in.